Second argument that they make is that every time these words, festival, new moon, or Sabbath day, every time these words appear together in the Old Testament, it's always referring to a special festival Sabbath day. Now, I want to show you that that is completely false. And anybody that tells you that has not looked at the passages in question. At least they haven't looked at them carefully. I'm going to show you without a shadow of a doubt that every time these three words appear together, they are referring to the weekly Sabbath. When it uses that word Sabbath day, it's referring to the weekly Sabbath day. First of all, it's worth noting that Leviticus 23. Now, Leviticus 23 is the chapter in Leviticus that lists all of the festivals in one chapter. And right at the beginning, it lists the weekly Sabbath. Let's go there together. Leviticus chapter 23. Leviticus chapter 23. And you see right at the beginning, let me read to you verses 1 and 2 just to get the context of the chapter. The beginning of the chapter, it says this: "And Yahweh spoke again to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, the appointed times," and the King James says feasts, "the appointed feasts of Yahweh, which you shall proclaim as holy convocations, my appointed times are these." And the very first one here listed is the Sabbath day. It says, "For 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. You shall not do any work. It is a Sabbath to Yahweh in all of your places of habitation." And then as you keep reading, it lists all of the other feasts that Israel was commanded to observe. So verses 4 to 8 lists the Passover. Verses 9 to 14 is the Feast of Harvest. Verses 15 to 22 is the Feast of Weeks. Verses 23 to 32 is the Feast of Trumpets. And verses 33 to 44 is the Feast of Booths. So very clearly here, the Sabbath day, the weekly Sabbath, is included in the lists of feasts that Israel is to observe. This is very, very clear here. And as I said, anybody who has made that argument that the Sabbath day is referring to, in Colossians, is referring to some special feast, Sabbath day, is completely wrong, because the weekly Sabbath is included in the feasts of Israel themselves. So that argument must be dismissed on that basis alone.
All right, now I have no other choice but to talk about it. Okay, so there was a lot that he said. He's basically saying this. His argument is this. When you go to Leviticus chapter 23, it says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them concerning the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations. Even these are my feasts." Then it mentions the Sabbath. 6 days shall your work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest. And then it goes over and talks about the Passover, the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of, and he calls it the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, which he called the feast also, and the Feast of Booths. He's saying because this is in the chapter that calls them all feasts, when you go back to I guess Colossians chapter 2, and I want to just make sure I'm rightly getting his argument. When you go back to Colossians 2, when it says, "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or respect of a holy day," which means feast. This is everything, right? And so this is, and I guess he's basically saying, he's talking about the seventh day Sabbath. And you know what? This is where I want our brothers and sisters to get a little sharper, because it is not clear to call all of these feasts. Okay, so let's look a little bit deeper into this, right? It says this: "Speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them concerning the feasts of the Lord." Now, some other translations don't say this. Some other translations say appointed times. But let's look at it. When it says H4150, right? That's the word using concerning the feast of the Lord. When you look in the concordance for this word, it's the word moed, right? And what the word moed means is properly an appointment. That is a fixed time or season, a festival, conventionally a year, by implication, an assembly, convene for a definite purpose, right? Technically the congregation, by extension, the place of meeting, also a signal as appointed beforehand. Here it is right here. It says also a signal as appointed beforehand, appointed. And notice what it says here: appointed, sign or time. Appointed time. Place of solemn assembly, congregation, solemn a set solemn feast, appointed due season, solemnity, synagogue, time, set time. How most translations who do it right, they properly call these things appointed times. Not all of these were feast, but they were all appointed times. Does that make sense? Right? So when we're looking at this, everything in the chapter, the whole chapter was an appointed time. But was everything a feast day? When we look at verse 6, for example, of course, we have the Passover. These are the feasts, right? These are the feasts. And again, that word, I'll just keep the concordance open, right? These are the feasts, H4150. That's the moed, the appointed time. These are the appointed times of the Lord, even holy convocations which you shall proclaim in their seasons. Then it talks about the Passover. In the 14th day of the first month, even is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast. Now notice this word. It's not the same word moed. It's not the same word appointed time. But it says feast. H2282. This is the word festival. That is a feast day, a sacrifice. These were days where you were literally supposed to have a feast on it. The Passover obviously was a feast because you had to eat the Passover. And the unleavened bread was another feast because you had to eat the unleavened bread. These were the feast days. And there is a distinction between the feast days and the Sabbath days. They were all called appointed times, but some of these appointed times were called feast days, and some of these appointed times were called Sabbaths. Let me give you more. So Passover, you had to have a feast on it. Unleavened bread, you had to have a feast on it. And then there was also tabernacles, verse 34. Look what it says. It says, "Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of the 17th month, of the 7th month, sorry, yeah, not 17 months. The 15th day of the 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles." Let's look at that word. It says this, H2282. It's not moed. It's chav, which is that festival, feast. So the ones that were feast days were the Passover, the unleavened bread, which they were basically connected. The tabernacles, those were the feast days, the ones that you literally had to have feast on. Well, which ones were the Sabbath days? Let's look. When you look at verse 24, the Feast of Trumpets, it says, and now, again, that word feast means appointed time. Don't think of everything as a feast. These were all appointed times, but it's translated as feast. But if you're going to be diligent, you'll understand that these are all appointed times. And some were called feasts, some were called Sabbaths. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, "Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, in the 1st day of the month, shall you have a" what?
Sabbath.
You shall have a Sabbath. So the trumpets was called a Sabbath. What about the Day of Atonement? Let's look at verse 27. It says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, also on the 10th day of the 7th month there shall be a Day of Atonement. It shall be a holy convocation unto you, and you shall afflict your souls and offer an offering made by fire." I'll fast forward to verse 32. It says this, "It shall be unto you a" what?
Sabbath of rest.
A Sabbath of rest, and you shall afflict your souls on the 9th day, right? So we have to be, and from even to even shall you celebrate your Sabbath. So we have to be diligent when we're saying this. We cannot call, and I'm speaking to Seventh-day Adventists, when you're teaching this subject, do not call everything a feast day, right? Some of them, call them appointed times, call them set times, but some of them were feast days and some of them were Sabbaths, okay? And so when we're going to Colossians, right, I'm going to keep going back and forth, you know, because we have to make this point very, very clear. "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or respect of a feast day." You can lump in there unleavened bread, tabernacles in that, and Passover. The new moon obviously was the 1st of the month. They had sacrifices on the 1st of the month. And the Sabbath days. Now, since this is all under the category of ceremonial Sabbath days, you can lump in this Sabbath days the trumpets and the Day of Atonement. Leviticus chapter 23 tells us very clearly that those were Sabbath days. Not only that, let me show you this. Because some people like to say, oh, hey, well, why does it say, the seventh day Sabbath? Again, it's because these are the appointed times. The seventh day of Sabbath, just like all the other days mentioned in this chapter, these were all appointed times, but they were on different categories. God already established the Sabbath day in the fourth commandment. You were supposed to have a holy convocation, according to this verse, on the Sabbath. These were times, appointed times for people to gather. But these were other times, the other feast days mentioned, or these other, set times mentioned, you were supposed to gather. Moses makes a distinction, even in this chapter, from the seventh day Sabbath and the other holy days mentioned in this chapter.
Come on, preacher.
Let's look at verse 38.
Come on, preacher.
Look at this. It says, these are the feasts of the Lord, right? And let's look at verse 37. Let me make sure I get that word right. H4150.
What?
Right? These are the moeds of the Lord, which means these are the appointed times of the Lord.
Come on.
That's what this chapter is about, appointed times. These are the appointed times of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, to offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord, a burnt offering, a meat offering, a sacrifice, and drink offerings, everything upon his day. Key word here, beside the Sabbath of the Lord. Beside the Sabbath of the Lord. So what this is saying is these things that are mentioned is separate from the Sabbath of the Lord. The Sabbath, they're all united because they're all appointed times, but they're separate still because the word says beside the Sabbaths of the Lord. So there's a distinction between all these holy days mentioned in this chapter and the seventh day Sabbath. So do not lump them all together as in they're all abolished. No, the ones that were specifically for the ceremonies, that was the Passover, the first fruits, the Day of Atonement, the Pentecost, atonement. Those were for purposes of reconciliation. Reconciliation from sin. And if you break the seventh day Sabbath, that is sin. Go ahead. You have something to say before I get to you?
No, I mean, I think you're hitting. I don't think I need to really add to what you're saying. You're already killing. But even just notice the wording, the Sabbath of the Lord, right? Which is very key kind of distinction. But if you notice, when you spoke about the Feast of Trumpets and the Day of Atonement, it said a Sabbath. One's a definite.
So these are definite articles. And I want to just show you, because some people will say, oh, what does beside mean? See how the word beside is being used. Beside the Sabbath of the Lord, besides your gifts, besides all your vows, besides all your freewill offerings, which you give unto the Lord. So these are something separate from them. Let's look at how the word beside is used in other places in the scripture. Numbers chapter 16, verse 49, as an example. Numbers chapter 16, verse 49 says this. Now, they that died in the plague were 14,700. How many people died?
14,700.
14,700. Beside them that died about the matter of Korah. Does the word beside mean, that this number includes those that died with Korah? No. This number is separated from the numbers that died with Korah. Let's look at another example. Numbers 28. It says this. Numbers 28, verse 23 and 24. It says this. It says, you shall offer these, right, beside the burnt offering in the morning, which is for a continual burnt offering, right? After this manner you shall offer daily, throughout the 7 days, the meat and the sacrifice made by fire for a sweet savor unto the Lord. It shall be offered beside the continual burnt offering and his drink offering. When you see the word beside, it's you're supposed to do the continual burnt offering, but do this beside that. Numbers chapter 29, verse 16, it says this. Just so you can see clearly how the word is consistently used beside. And 1 kid of the goats for a sin offering beside the continual burnt offering. So that means you're supposed to do this kid offering separated from their continual burnt offering, his meat offering and drink offering. I'll give one more. Deuteronomy 19, verse 9. And there's even more than this. I'm just giving a few. Here's about the commandments. If thou shalt keep all these commandments to do them, which I command thee this day, to love the Lord thy God and to walk ever in his ways, then shalt thou add 3 cities more for thee beside these 3. So what this is saying is like, look, I'm going to give you 3 cities in addition to the 3 cities that you already had. So when God is using the word beside, he's saying, look, do this in addition. Michael Mutaketsa, man, you should have really been here. He says, verse 3 and 4 separates the Sabbath from the other appointed times. That's exactly correct. Let me tell you something else. When it says Colossians 2:16, right? So it's very clear, and I just want to hammer this, and I promise I won't speak that much for the rest of the night. But don't hold me to that. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or respect of the holy days. So again, these are the feast days, the unleavened bread, Passover, tabernacles, or of the new moon, of course, the month, right? Or of the Sabbath days. Now, I mentioned to you trumpets and Day of Atonement. Randy, were there other Sabbath days besides the trumpets and Day of Atonement?
I believe so. Yes, there were. There's also the Jubilee, I believe, was one of them. I'm correct.
Let's look at it. Leviticus chapter 25. It says this, speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them, when you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep what?
A Sabbath. Come on.
Keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. 6 years shall thou shall sow thy field, in 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow the field nor prune the vineyard. So there were other Sabbaths besides those feast days or those holy convocations that were mentioned.
Brother. The whole year was a Sabbath. The whole year was a Sabbath.
Verses 8 through 10, it says this, the year of Jubilee. This is what you said. And thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years. And the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto thee 49 years. And then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, which is the Day of Atonement. And the Day of Atonement shall you make the trumpet sound throughout all your land. Right? So these things are all pointing to Jesus Christ. The year of Jubilee is something we're looking for. The real fulfillment of the year of Jubilee when Jesus restores everything to us. So again, I want to just hammer on this point that Leviticus chapter 23, when it's talking about the 7th day Sabbath, it's talking about, when it says the feast, it means appointed times. It doesn't mean that it was a feast day. And so we got to do better when we teach Colossians chapter 2, verse 16. Do not say any longer in Colossians 2:16 that when it says a holy day or the feast days, these are all the feast days. Because then you're going to have guys like the one in this video that says, well, if they're all the feast days, then obviously this has to be talking about the 7th day Sabbath.
Yeah.
Because if you're lumping all the feast days in this word, what about, the 7th day Sabbath? But no, this is talking about the actual days you had to have feasts on, the actual new moon, and the ceremonial Sabbath days. These are all under the Sabbath days. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. Clear to me.
Yep. So these were all ordinances. So I'm done. I'm done on that point. Unless you have anything to add. Yeah.
Brother, I don't think I need to add to that.
Okay. Let's move right on then.